I'm Lieutenant Colonel Mara Keene, 39 years old, call sign Nightfang. I joined the Air Force fresh out of the academy, one of 6 women in a fighter wing of 73, and earned my name the hard way, by flying into a war zone and pulling 2 men out of a burning F-16 when command said to abort. For years, I gave everything to the mission, my time, my loyalty, my sleep, my silence, believing that professionalism would always earn respect. But the day a young captain laughed in a briefing and called me a secretary, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed, mocked, or underestimated by someone who never earned half of what you gave? If you have, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground after being disrespected, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries, respect, and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. I walked into the briefing room at 1,600 hours, flight blues pressed sharp, silver oak leaves catching the overhead lights. The room was already half full, captains, majors, a few lieutenant colonels like me. Joint intel briefing meant Army, Navy, Air Force all crammed into one space, competing egos and all. I'd been to hundreds of these. I knew the rhythm, the posturing, the way younger officers sized each other up before the general walked in. I moved toward an empty seat near the front, briefcase in hand, and that's when I heard it. Did someone bring their secretary? The voice came from my left. Captain Spars. Clean-shaven, mid-20s maybe, leaning back in his chair with the kind of ease that told me he'd never been shot at. A few others laughed, not loud, but enough. That low chuckle that says someone just scored a point. I stopped. Didn't turn my head right away. Just stood there, letting the silence stretch long enough that the laughter died on its own. Then I looked at him. Brown hair, regulation cut, name tape that read Mallory. His smirk was still there, but it wavered when I didn't flinch. "Ma'am," he added, like that fixed it. I set my briefcase down, straightened, and met his eyes. "Call sign," I said evenly, Nightfang. The room went still. Not the kind of quiet that comes from respect. This was recognition. The kind that makes people sit up straighter without realizing it. Mallory's smirk vanished. His jaw tightened. I could see him trying to place it, and then he did. Everyone did. Nightfang wasn't folklore. It was documented. Operation Solstice. Black Ops air strike over hostile territory, 48 hours off-grid, extraction under fire. I'd pulled 2 men out of a burning F-16 while insurgents closed in. The footage was classified, but the story wasn't. A general cleared his throat from the doorway. "Proceed, Colonel Keene." I took my seat. Mallory didn't make eye contact again. That moment didn't feel like victory. It felt like exhaustion. I joined the Air Force at 22, fresh out of the academy, one of 6 women in a fighter wing of 73. They didn't say I didn't belong, not out loud. They just didn't make space. Locker rooms stayed quiet when I walked in. Briefings ran long without breaks. Flight assignments came last. I learned early that proving yourself wasn't a one-time event. It was every day, every mission, every conversation where someone assumed you were support staff instead of the pilot. I earned my wings the same way everyone else did, hours in the cockpit, simulator runs until my hands cramped, written exams that tested not just knowledge but decision-making under pressure. But when I landed my first solo sortie without a hitch, the congratulations were thin. "Good job," they said, the way you'd compliment a kid who finally tied their shoes right. So I stopped waiting for congratulations. I flew better. Studied harder. Took the assignments no one wanted, night missions, high-risk zones, the kind of ops where one mistake meant you didn't come home. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because if I was going to be in this uniform, I was going to be undeniable. Operation Solstice changed that. It was supposed to be a standard strike, get in, neutralize the target, get out. But intel was bad. We flew into a hornet's nest. Ground fire lit up the sky. My wingman took a hit, went down hard in hostile territory. I had fuel for maybe 20 minutes. Command said abort. I didn't. I found the wreckage, landed in a clearing that was barely long enough, and pulled 2 men out while rounds pinged off the fuselage. One of them couldn't walk. The other was unconscious. I dragged them both into my cockpit, flew out on fumes, and made it back to base with less than 2 minutes of fuel left. The next day, they gave me a commendation. The day after that, they gave me a call sign. Nightfang. It stuck because it was true. I'd flown into the dark and come back with teeth. For a while, that was enough. Respect wasn't given freely, but it was given. I climbed to captain, then major, then lieutenant colonel. I took on roles that mattered, mentoring junior officers, shaping strategy, making sure the mission stayed clean even when politics got messy. I believed in the system. I believed that if you did the work spoke for itself. But systems have short memories. The new generation started arriving about 3 years ago. Younger, sharper in some ways, softer in others. They grew up with drones and satellite intel, not dogfights and ejection seats. They knew how to run data models and optimize mission parameters, but they'd never felt the stick shake in their hands when an engine flamed out at 30,000 feet. They were good at their jobs. I'm not saying they weren't, but they didn't know what it cost to earn a call sign. Captain Reed Mallory was one of them. Late 20s, fast-tracked through officer training, top marks in tactical systems. He had the kind of resume that looked perfect on paper, clean, efficient, no rough edges. He'd done a few deployments, but nothing that left scars. Nothing that made him wake up at 0300 because his brain couldn't tell the difference between a car backfire and incoming fire. He was smart. I'll give him that. But smart doesn't mean wise. The first time I noticed him, he was holding court in the ready room, surrounded by a cluster of younger officers. He was explaining why the old guard didn't understand modern warfare, how air superiority was about algorithms now, not instinct. He said it with a grin, the kind that invited agreement. A few of them laughed. One of them glanced at me, then looked away fast. I didn't react. I'd heard worse. In Kandahar, a colonel once told me women pilots were a liability because we couldn't handle G-forces as well. I flew circles around him in a training exercise the next week. This was just noise. But the noise got louder. In meetings, Mallory started making small comments. Maybe we should ask someone with field experience, he'd say, then turn to an officer who'd been deployed for 6 months. Never mind that I'd logged more combat hours than half the room combined. Or he'd interrupt mid-briefing with a question that implied I hadn't considered basic variables I'd already addressed in the report he clearly hadn't read. The disrespect was subtle. That's what made it dangerous. It wasn't loud enough to call out, but it was persistent enough to shift the room's temperature. Other officers started echoing it. Ma'am turned into miss. Salutes got lazy. One captain asked if I needed help carrying my gear, not because it was heavy, but because he assumed I couldn't manage. An old friend, Major Rios, pulled me aside after one particularly tense briefing. Rios had been my wingman during Solstice. He'd been one of the men I pulled out of that wreck. We didn't talk about it much, but the bond was there. They think you're a figurehead, he said quietly. The kind they trot out for diversity photos. I stared at him. I've been flying missions since before some of them could drive. I know, but they don't. And Mallory's making sure they don't ask. I wanted to argue. I wanted to say it didn't matter, that results spoke louder than reputation. But I'd seen this before. Respect isn't static. It erodes. And once it starts, it's hard to stop. I decided to let it go. I had work to do, missions to plan, officers to train. I didn't have time to manage egos. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. The uniform I wore still carried weight, but only with people who remembered why. The disrespect continued in small, corrosive ways. During a planning session for a joint training exercise, Mallory suggested we bring in someone with recent combat experience to review the air support protocols. I'd written half of those protocols. When I pointed that out, he nodded, smiled, and said, right, but I meant someone who's been in theater recently. I had been. 6 months ago. Afghanistan. Classified op. He would have known that if he'd read the clearance logs. No one corrected him. Another time, in the operations center, a young lieutenant asked Mallory a question about evasive maneuvers under SAM fire. Mallory launched into an explanation, textbook accurate, no real-world weight behind it. I was standing 10 feet away. The lieutenant never looked at me. It wasn't malicious. It was worse. It was automatic. I'd become invisible. I started noticing it everywhere. Conversations that stopped when I entered a room, not because I was respected, but because I was irrelevant. Meetings where my input was acknowledged with a polite nod and then promptly ignored. A briefing where a captain, barely 2 years out of training, corrected my assessment of enemy air defense systems. He was wrong. I knew he was wrong because I'd flown against those systems. But the room didn't push back. They just moved on. Rios called me one evening, his voice tight. "You hearing the rumors?" "Which ones?" "That you're being considered for a staff reassignment. Desk job. Pentagon, maybe. They're calling it a strategic advisory role." I gripped the phone harder. "I didn't request a transfer." "I know. But they're saying you've done your time in the field. That it's time to let the next generation lead." The next generation. As if leadership was a matter of birth year and not blood earned. I'd spent 2 decades proving I belonged. I'd flown in wars that most of these officers only read about in after-action reports. I'd trained pilots who went on to command their own squadrons. I'd stood in front of review boards and congressional committees and defended mission parameters that saved lives. And now, because I wasn't young and photogenic and media-friendly, I was being shuffled aside. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my quarters, still in uniform, boots still laced, staring at the wall. I thought about the younger version of myself, 22, eager, naive enough to believe that excellence was enough. I thought about every time I'd bitten my tongue, every slight I'd let slide, every moment I'd chosen professionalism over pride. Maybe that was the mistake. Maybe silence looked like acceptance. The joint intel briefing was scheduled for late afternoon, 1,600 hours. High-level staff from all branches, including a 2-star general I'd worked with years ago. The topic was emerging threats in the Pacific Theater, my area of focus for the last 18 months. I'd prepared extensively. Data, projections, risk assessments. This was my briefing. My work. I arrived early, as always. The room was filling up. I saw Mallory near the front, leaning back in his chair, talking to another captain. They were laughing about something. When I walked past, Mallory glanced up. That's when he said it. "Did someone bring their secretary?" "I've been shot at. I've had engine failures at altitude. I've pulled dying men out of burning metal." But in that moment, standing in a room full of officers I'd served alongside, wearing a uniform I'd earned every inch of, that single sentence hit harder than any of it. Because it wasn't just disrespect. It was erasure. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel. It was casual. That's what made it worse. They weren't trying to hurt me. They just didn't see me as a threat. Didn't see me as a peer. Didn't see me at all. I stood there, briefcase in hand, and let the silence grow. Mallory's grin started to fade. He must have realized I wasn't going to laugh it off, wasn't going to play along. The room began to quiet, one conversation at a time, until everyone was watching. I looked directly at him. "Call sign," I said, voice steady, Nightfang. The effect was immediate. Mallory's face went pale. The captain next to him straightened. Across the room, I saw a major I didn't recognize lean over and whisper something to his neighbor. The name carried weight. Not because I'd asked for it, but because it was documented, verified, undeniable. Operation Solstice wasn't legend. It was record. General Porter entered from the side door, 2 aides trailing him. He took one look at the room, silent, tense, everyone standing a little straighter, and nodded toward me. "Proceed, Colonel Keene." I moved to the front, set down my briefcase, and opened the presentation. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't waver. I walked them through the intelligence, the threat assessments, the recommended countermeasures. Every data point was precise. Every conclusion was supported. I didn't rush. I didn't apologize. I didn't explain. I commanded. When I finished, General Porter asked 2 questions. I answered both without hesitation. He nodded, satisfied, and dismissed the room. Officers filed out in silence. Mallory avoided eye contact. One of the majors, someone I didn't know, stopped on his way out and gave me a small nod. Not friendship. just acknowledgement. I packed up my materials slowly, giving everyone time to leave. When the room was empty, I stood there for a moment, staring at the podium. The laughter still echoed in my head, but it felt distant now. Smaller. Rios found me in my office an hour later. He didn't knock, just walked in and sat down across from me. "Word's spreading," he said. "Nightfang's back." I looked up from my desk. "I never left." He smiled, but it was sad around the edges. "I know. But they forgot." I leaned back in my chair, exhaling. "I shouldn't have to remind them." "No," he agreed. "You shouldn't. But you did. And they'll remember now." I wasn't sure if that was true. Memory was unreliable. Respect was even more so. But something had shifted. Not in the room, in me. For years, I'd told myself that proving my worth was about earning their validation. But sitting there, watching Rios's steady gaze, I realized I'd been wrong. Proving myself was never about them. It was about reminding myself that I didn't need their permission to exist. Rios stood to leave, paused at the door. "You know he's going to try to make this right, don't you?" "Mallory?" "Yeah. He's young, but he's not stupid. He'll realize what he stepped in." I shrugged. "Doesn't matter." "It does," Rios said quietly. "Because if he learns, it means the system can too." I didn't respond. After he left, I sat alone in the dim light of my office, still in uniform, still composed. Outside, the base was winding down for the evening, footsteps in hallways, distant voices, the hum of machinery that never really stopped. For the first time in months, I felt something close to clarity. The laughter had stung. The disrespect had worn me down. But the moment I'd said my call sign out loud, I'd reclaimed something I'd been letting slip away. Not their respect. Mine. I called for a closed-door meeting the next morning. Not with Mallory, not yet. With General Porter. His office was on the third floor of the command building, a space that smelled like old coffee and printer toner. He looked up when I walked in, gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Colonel Keene," he said. "I assume this is about yesterday." "Yes, sir." He leaned back, folding his hands over his stomach. Porter was in his 50s, graying at the temples, the kind of officer who'd seen enough to know when to stay quiet. "You handled it well," he said. "Better than most would have." "Thank you, sir. But that's not why I'm here." He raised an eyebrow. "Go on." I kept my voice measured. "Captain Mallory's conduct was inappropriate. But writing him up won't fix the problem. It'll just make him resent me, and it'll signal to the others that I need protection. I don't. So, what do you want?" "I want him reassigned under my supervision." "Leadership development. If he's going to be an effective officer, he needs to understand what command actually costs." Porter studied me for a long moment. "You're not looking for revenge." "No, sir. I'm looking for accountability." He nodded slowly. "I'll make it happen. But understand, this puts a target on your back. People will say you're using your rank to settle scores. Let them." He smiled, just a little. "Dismissed, Colonel." The reassignment came through within 48 hours. Mallory reported to my office the following Monday, his face carefully neutral. I didn't offer him a seat. I handed him a binder, 2 inches thick, mission briefs, and tactical scenarios. "You'll be running night simulations for the next 6 weeks," I said. "Every scenario is based on real operations. Some of them are mine. You'll brief me on your decisions every morning at 0600. If you're late, we start over." He opened his mouth, then closed it. "Yes, ma'am. This isn't punishment, Captain. It's education. You're a smart officer. But smart doesn't mean experienced. You're going to learn the difference." He left without another word. The first week was rough. Mallory showed up on time, but his briefs were sloppy, overconfident assessments, gaps in contingency planning, the kind of mistakes that got people killed in the field. I didn't yell. I didn't humiliate him. I just asked questions. What's your backup if communications go dark? How do you extract your team if the LZ is compromised? What happens if your intel is wrong? Every question exposed a flaw. Every flaw was a lesson. By the second week, he started preparing better. His briefs got tighter. He stopped trying to impress me and started trying to solve problems. I pushed him harder, longer simulations, more variables, scenarios where there was no clean answer. I made him experience what it felt like to make decisions under pressure, when every choice had consequences and none of them were good. One night, around 2,100 hours, I found him still in the simulation lab, headset on, running through a night strike for the third time. I stood in the doorway, watching. He didn't notice me. He was too focused, too deep in the scenario. When he finally pulled the headset off, he looked exhausted. "You're going to burn out if you keep this pace," I said. He jumped, turned. "Ma'am, I didn't hear you come in." "That's the point." I stepped inside, glanced at the screen. "You failed that scenario twice already. What makes you think the third time will be different?" He hesitated. "I keep losing the wingman in the final pass. I'm trying to figure out how to adjust the approach angle." "You can't." He frowned. "Ma'am, that scenario is based on Operation Solstice. There is no approach angle that saves everyone. The question isn't how to win. It's how to minimize loss." He stared at me. "You lost someone?" "No, but I almost did. And I've carried that weight every day since." He sat back, rubbing his face. "I don't know how you do it. You learn. Or you quit." He looked up, something raw in his expression. "I was an ass in that briefing." "Yes. I didn't know who you were." I crossed my arms. "You shouldn't have needed to." He nodded slowly. "You're right. I didn't accept the apology." "Not yet." Words were easy. I needed to see if the lesson stuck. Over the next few weeks, something shifted. Mallory stopped performing and started learning. He asked better questions. He admitted when he didn't know something. He started staying late not because I told him to, but because he wanted to understand. I watched him struggle with the weight of command, the knowledge that every decision you make affects lives, that leadership isn't about being right, it's about being responsible. One afternoon, he asked if he could watch the footage from Solstice. I hesitated. That footage was classified, but portions had been declassified for training purposes. I pulled it up on the secure server, let him watch in silence. The cockpit view, the ground fire, the moment I landed in that clearing and pulled two men out while the world burned around us. When it ended, he sat there, staring at the blank screen. "You didn't hesitate," he said quietly. "I didn't have time to." He turned to me. "How do you live with that? Knowing that if you'd made one wrong move, you don't live with it by pretending it didn't happen. You live with it by making sure it means something." He nodded, and I saw something in his face I hadn't seen before. Not fear. Not arrogance. Respect. Not for my rank. For what it cost to earn it. A month into his reassignment, we ran a live-fire training exercise, full simulation, real-time decision-making, multiple units coordinating under combat conditions. Mallory was running air support coordination. Halfway through, communications went dark. A systems failure, unplanned. The kind of thing that happens in real ops and turns missions into disasters. I watched from the command center, waiting to see how he'd handle it. For 30 seconds, nothing. Then his voice came through, calm and clear, directing units to switch to backup channels, rerouting coordination through ground relays, stabilizing the situation before it spiraled. When the exercise ended, the review board commended his performance. He didn't take credit. He stood in front of them and said, "Colonel Keene drilled that protocol into me. I just followed her lead." That night, Rios called me. "You hear about Mallory?" I was there. "He's telling everyone you saved his career." I didn't respond right away. I thought about the briefing room, the laughter, the way he looked at me like I was invisible. And then I thought about the last month, the long hours, the hard questions, the slow transformation from arrogance to competence. "He saved his own career," I said finally. "I just gave him the tools." Rios laughed. "You're too generous." "No, I'm just realistic. People can change. But only if they want to." I didn't know if Mallory's change would last. I didn't know if the others would follow his lead. But I knew this. I'd stopped waiting for validation. I'd stopped letting their disrespect define my worth. And somewhere in the process of holding him accountable, I'd reminded myself why I wore this uniform in the first place. Not for them. For the mission. And the mission didn't care about ego. It only cared about results. 3 months after Mallory's reassignment, we attended a combined operations summit. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, all gathered to review joint tactical protocols. These summits were usually tedious, full of bureaucratic posturing and inter-service rivalry. I went because I had to, not because I wanted to. Mallory was there too. He'd been performing well, earning his place back among the other captains. I'd written a positive evaluation for his file, not because I'd forgiven him, but because he'd earned it. Growth deserved acknowledgement, even if the relationship remained professional and distant. We sat at a long conference table, nameplates in front of us, coffee going cold in paper cups. A Marine colonel, graying, barrel-chested, the kind of officer who thought volume equaled authority, was holding court about air-ground coordination. He made a dismissive comment about desk pilots who'd never seen real combat, his eyes flicking briefly in my direction. I didn't react. I'd heard it before. Different uniform, same ignorance. But Mallory did. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice cutting through the room. "You're talking about Colonel Keene." "Nightfang. Operation Solstice." The Marine colonel frowned. "I wasn't referring to anyone specifically." "Yes, you were." Mallory's tone was respectful but firm. "And you should know that Colonel Keene has more combat hours than most of this room combined. She's pulled men out of enemy fire, flown Black Ops missions that are still classified, and trained half the officers in this building. You don't joke about her." The table went quiet. I felt every eye turn toward me, then back to Mallory. The Marine colonel's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He just nodded curtly and moved on to the next topic. I didn't look at Mallory. I kept my eyes on my notes, my expression neutral. But inside, something shifted. Not gratitude, exactly. More like recognition. He hadn't defended me because he felt guilty. He defended me because he understood, finally, what respect actually meant. After the meeting, I found him in the hallway. He was checking his phone, leaning against the wall. When he saw me, he straightened. "Colonel. Captain." He waited, uncertain. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "Yes, I did." I studied him for a moment. "Why?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Because 3 months ago, I didn't understand what command cost. I thought it was about rank and authority. But you showed me it's about responsibility. And part of that responsibility is making sure the people who've earned respect actually get it." I nodded slowly. "You've come a long way, Captain. I had a good teacher." I didn't smile, but I gave him a small nod. Not friendship, we weren't there, and maybe we'd never be. But respect, the kind you earn inch by inch, mission by mission. The kind that doesn't require affection, just acknowledgement. "Keep it up," I said, and walked away. The weeks that followed were different. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Other officers started mirroring Mallory's shift, asking better questions, listening more carefully, treating experience like the asset it was instead of a relic to be politely ignored. The younger generation didn't suddenly revere the old guard, but they stopped dismissing us out of hand. In staff meetings, my assessments were debated, not discarded. In training exercises, junior officers sought me out for advice. The disrespect didn't vanish entirely, it never does, but it lost its casual cruelty. It stopped being automatic. Rios and I had dinner one evening at the officers' club, a rare break from the grind. He raised his glass. "To Nightfang. Still terrifying junior officers after all these years." I clinked my glass against his. "I'm not trying to terrify anyone." "I know. That's what makes it effective." I took a sip, set the glass down. "You think it'll last?" "The change," he considered. "Some of it. People like Mallory, they'll carry it forward. But there'll always be new officers who don't know the history, who think their tech and their degrees mean they don't need to learn from the past. You'll have to keep proving yourself. It's exhausting, but it's the job." "I'm tired, Rios." He looked at me, his expression softening. "I know. But you're also still here. That counts for something." I didn't argue. He was right. I was still here, still flying missions when I could, still training the next wave, still carrying the weight of a call sign I'd earned in blood and fire. I was tired, but I wasn't done. Not yet. A few weeks later, I received an email from the Academy, a request for me to guest speak at a leadership seminar for senior cadets. They wanted someone to talk about command under pressure, decision-making in combat, the kind of lessons you couldn't get from textbooks. I almost declined. I didn't enjoy public speaking, didn't like being put on display. But then I thought about the cadets, 22 years old, eager, naive, standing where I'd stood 2 decades ago. They deserved to hear the truth, not the sanitized version. I accepted. The seminar was held in a lecture hall, about 100 cadets packed into rows of seats. They looked impossibly young, their uniforms crisp and new, their faces open and unscarred. I stood at the podium, notes in front of me, and looked out at them. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Mara Keene," I began. "Call sign Nightfang. I've been in the Air Force for 20 years. I've flown combat missions, trained pilots, and spent more time in hostile airspace than I care to remember. I'm here to talk to you about leadership. But first, I want to clarify something." I paused, letting the room settle. "Rank gives you authority. It means people have to follow your orders, salute you, respect the position you hold. But rank doesn't make you a leader. Character does. And character is built in the moments when no one is watching, when the mission is falling apart, when you have to make a decision that will haunt you for the rest of your life." I walked them through Operation Solstice, not the heroic version, but the real one. The fear, the uncertainty, the moment I had to choose between following orders and saving lives. I told them about the weight of command, the way it never really leaves you, the nightmares and the second-guessing and the knowledge that you'll never know if you made the right call. "Leadership isn't about being fearless," I said. "It's about being afraid and doing it anyway. It's about making the hard calls and living with the consequences. And it's about earning respect, not demanding it." When I finished, the room was silent. Then one cadet raised her hand. "Ma'am, how do you deal with people who don't respect you?" I smiled, just a little. "You prove them wrong. Not for them, for yourself. Because at the end of the day, the only person whose respect you really need is the one staring back at you in the mirror." The applause was polite but genuine. Afterward, several cadets approached me, asking questions, shaking my hand. One of them, a young woman, barely 20, looked at me with something like awe. "I want to be like you," she said. I met her eyes. "No, you don't. You want to be like yourself. Better, stronger, sharper. Learn from my mistakes, but don't try to be me. The Air Force doesn't need more Nightfangs. It needs more leaders who know who they are and why they're here." She nodded, uncertain but determined. I left the academy that evening feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride, exactly. More like purpose. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But I wasn't fighting alone anymore. 2 years later, I was promoted to colonel. Oh, 6. It wasn't a surprise. My record was solid, my evaluation strong, but it still felt surreal. I'd spent so long focused on the mission, on proving myself day after day, that I hadn't really considered what came next. The promotion ceremony was small, held in a conference room with a handful of senior officers and close colleagues. General Porter pinned the eagles onto my shoulders, his expression unreadable but respectful. "Congratulations, Colonel Keene. You've earned this." "Thank you, sir." Rios was there, now a lieutenant colonel himself. He grinned at me from the back of the room. After the ceremony, we walked across the base together, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Heavy." He laughed. "That's command." "I know." I glanced at him. "You think I'm ready?" "You've been ready for years. The question is whether the system is ready for you." I didn't have an answer for that. My new assignment was command of a joint intelligence wing, Army, Navy, Air Force analysts working together to assess emerging threats and coordinate tactical responses. It was high level, high pressure, the kind of role where mistakes had geopolitical consequences. I'd been preparing for it, but that didn't make it less daunting. My first day in the new office, I found a stack of personnel files on my desk. One of them was Mallory's. He'd been promoted to major, was now leading one of my intel sections. I opened the file, skimmed his recent evaluations. Solid performance, strong leadership scores, a note from his previous CO praising his ability to mentor junior officers. He'd come a long way. I called him into my office that afternoon. He knocked, entered, stood at attention. Colonel Keene. Congratulations on the promotion. At ease, Major. Sit. He did, his posture still formal. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something more grounded. He'd matured, not just in rank but in presence. I've reviewed your file, I said. You've done well. Thank you, ma'am. I'm assigning you to lead the Pacific Threat Assessment Team. It's a critical role. You'll be briefing flag officers, coordinating with PACOM, and making recommendations that will shape our posture in the region. Are you up for it? He met my eyes. Yes, ma'am. Good. Because I'm counting on you. Not because I owe you anything, but because you've proven you can handle it. He nodded. I won't let you down. I know. He stood to leave, paused at the door. Colonel, can I ask you something? Go ahead. Do you ever regret it? The way you handled things with me, I mean. You could have ended my career. Instead, you gave me a chance. I considered the question. I don't believe in ending careers out of spite, Major. But I also don't believe in second chances without accountability. You earned your way back. That's on you, not me. He smiled, small and genuine. Still. Thank you. After he left, I sat alone in my office, the weight of the Eagles on my shoulders a constant reminder of how far I'd come. I thought about the briefing room, the laughter, the moment I'd said my call sign out loud and reclaimed something I'd been letting slip away. I thought about the long nights in the simulation lab, watching Mallory struggle with the weight of command. I thought about the cadets at the academy, their faces open and eager, believing that the uniform would protect them from doubt. It wouldn't. But maybe that was the point. Leadership wasn't about certainty. It was about carrying uncertainty with grace. The months that followed were a blur of briefings, coordination meetings, and late-night intelligence reviews. The Pacific Theater was heating up, territorial disputes, military buildups, the kind of slow-burn tensions that could erupt into something catastrophic if mishandled. My team worked around the clock, analyzing satellite imagery, signals intelligence, troop movements. Every assessment we produced went up the chain, sometimes all the way to the Joint Chiefs. Mallory's team was sharp. He'd built a culture of rigor and collaboration, pushing his analysts to question assumptions and stress-test their conclusions. In meetings, he presented findings with confidence, but not arrogance, acknowledging gaps in intelligence rather than papering over them. He'd become the kind of officer I'd hoped he could be, someone who understood that leadership was service, not status. One evening, around 2,100 hours, I found him still at his desk, screens glowing in the dim light. I knocked on the doorframe. He looked up, startled. Colonel, I didn't realize you were still here. Could say the same about you. I stepped inside, glanced at his monitors. What are you working on? New imagery from the South China Sea. Possible naval buildup near the Spratlys. I'm trying to determine if it's routine or a prelude to something bigger. I moved closer, studied the images. What's your assessment? Inconclusive. Could go either way. But my gut says it's more than routine. Your gut? He smiled, just a little. You taught me that data only gets you so far. Sometimes you have to trust instinct. I nodded. Just make sure your instinct is based on experience, not hope. Yes, ma'am. I left him to his work, but his words stayed with me. I'd taught him that. Not through lectures or formal training, but through example, through showing him what it meant to carry the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. The system was changing. Slowly, unevenly, but changing. Officers like Mallory were learning to value experience alongside innovation, to recognize that the old guard wasn't obsolete. We were the foundation on which the next generation built. And officers like me were learning to let go, to trust that the lessons we'd fought so hard to impart would take root and grow. But not everyone was ready for that change. During a high-level briefing with representatives from all branches, a Navy captain, someone I didn't know, challenged one of my assessments about Chinese submarine activity. His tone was dismissive, the kind of casual condescension that suggested he didn't take me seriously. With all due respect, Colonel, I think you're overestimating the threat. Our sonar data doesn't support your conclusions. I kept my voice even. Your sonar data is 3 weeks old. Mine is from yesterday. And it's not just sonar, it's correlated with satellite imagery, signals intercepts, and human intelligence. The picture is clear. He leaned back, skeptical. I've been tracking submarine activity in the Pacific for 5 years. I think I know what I'm looking at. Before I could respond, Mallory spoke up. Captain, with respect, Colonel Keene has been analyzing Pacific threats for 2 decades. If she says there's a pattern, there's a pattern. I'd suggest you review the full intelligence package before dismissing her assessment. The room went quiet. The Navy captain's face reddened, but he didn't argue. He just nodded stiffly and moved on. After the briefing, I pulled Mallory aside. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. You were right, and he was wrong. Someone needed to say it. I looked at him, this officer who'd once mocked me, who'd learned through sweat and humility what respect actually meant. You've become a good leader, Major. I'm trying to be. You set a hell of a standard. I didn't respond. What was there to say? He'd learned the lesson. Now it was up to him to teach it to others. The weeks turned into months. The Pacific situation stabilized, then flared again, then stabilized once more. My team worked seamlessly, producing intelligence that shaped strategy, that kept conflicts from escalating, that saved lives in ways no one would ever know about. That was the nature of intelligence work. Success was invisible, failure was catastrophic. But I knew. And my team knew. And that was enough. One afternoon, I received a letter from the Air Force Academy. Another request to speak, this time at a symposium on women in military leadership. I almost declined again. I'd never been comfortable being reduced to a symbol, a token, a story about overcoming adversity. But then I read the rest of the letter. The symposium wasn't about celebrating diversity. It was about examining institutional barriers, about honest conversations on how to build a military that valued competence over demographics, that recognized talent regardless of gender or background. That I could support. I accepted. The symposium was larger than the last event. Several hundred attendees, mostly officers, but also civilian defense analysts and policymakers. I was one of several speakers, all of us women who'd reached senior ranks despite systemic obstacles. We sat on a panel, fielding questions about our careers, our challenges, our perspectives on change. One question stood out. A young lieutenant, fresh-faced and earnest, asked, "How do you maintain your identity in a system that wasn't designed for you?" The other panelists gave thoughtful answers about resilience, about finding mentors, about building support networks. When it was my turn, I paused, considering. You don't maintain your identity, I said finally. You forge it. Every day, in every decision, in every moment when someone tells you that you don't belong. You prove them wrong, not by becoming what they expect, but by becoming undeniable. And eventually, the system adapts. Not because it wants to, but because it has to. The room was silent. Then the lieutenant nodded, her expression resolute. After the panel, several officers approached me. Some wanted advice. Some wanted to share their own stories. One, a major I didn't recognize, pulled me aside. "I was in that briefing," she said quietly. "The one where the captain called you a secretary." I stiffened. I didn't realize anyone else remembered. We all remember. Some of us were ashamed that we didn't speak up. But watching how you handled it, watching how you turned that moment into accountability instead of revenge, that taught us more than any training ever could. I didn't know what to say. I'd spent so long focused on my own struggle, my own fight for respect, that I hadn't considered how visible it was. How many others were watching, learning, drawing strength from my refusal to disappear. "Thank you," I said finally, "for telling me." She nodded and walked away. That night, I sat in my quarters, still in uniform, thinking about the weight of visibility. I'd never wanted to be a symbol. I just wanted to do my job, to serve with honor, to earn my place through competence and courage. But somewhere along the way, my presence had become more than personal. It had become proof that women could command, could lead, could carry the weight of war without breaking. I thought about the young lieutenant, the major who'd spoken up, the cadets I'd addressed at the academy. I thought about Mallory, learning to see past his assumptions. I thought about all the officers, male and female, who were watching, learning, building a military that valued character over comfort. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. There would always be new officers who didn't know the history, who made the same mistakes, who had to learn the hard way what respect actually meant. But the system was changing, one officer at a time, one lesson at a time. And I was still here. Still fighting. Still proving that leadership wasn't about rank or recognition. It was about showing up, day after day, and doing the work that needed to be done. Even when no one was watching. Especially then. The years that followed brought a rhythm I hadn't expected. Not peace, exactly, but something like equilibrium. My command ran efficiently, my team performed at the highest levels, and the respect I'd fought so hard to reclaim became something I no longer had to demand. It was simply there, woven into the fabric of how people interacted with me. But respect, I'd learned, was fragile. It required maintenance. A new wave of junior officers rotated in, bright, ambitious, many of them carrying the same assumptions that Mallory had carried years ago. They looked at my eagles, my ribbons, my call sign, and saw history. Ancient history. Something to be acknowledged politely, and then set aside in favor of newer methodologies, newer technologies, newer thinking. I didn't take it personally. I'd been that junior officer once, convinced that my generation had all the answers. Time had taught me otherwise. One of the new captains, a woman named Brennan, mid-20s, Ivy League degree, top of her class, approached me after a briefing. "Colonel, I've been reviewing some of your older assessments. The frameworks you used, they're pretty traditional. Have you considered incorporating machine learning models? They could enhance predictive accuracy significantly." I looked at her, this officer who meant well but didn't yet understand that intelligence wasn't just about data. "Captain Brennan, machine learning is a tool. A good one. But it can't account for human behavior, for cultural context, for the 1,000 variables that don't fit neatly into algorithms. Use the models. But don't trust them blindly." She nodded, but I could see the skepticism in her eyes. She thought I was resistant to change, stuck in old patterns. She'd learn. They all did, eventually. 2 months later, Brennan's team produced an assessment predicting low probability of military action in a disputed border region. The machine learning model had analyzed troop movements, supply logistics, communications patterns, all the quantifiable data. The conclusion was confident, no imminent threat. I read the assessment, then pulled up the raw intelligence. The numbers looked clean, but something felt wrong. I'd spent enough time in hostile regions to recognize the patterns that data couldn't capture, the way local populations evacuated before official announcements, the way diplomatic language shifted in subtle, but telling ways. I called Brennan into my office. "Your assessment says low probability." "I disagree." She blinked. "Ma'am, the model is pretty clear. All the indicators suggest, I know what the model suggests. I'm telling you it's missing something. Human intelligence from the region shows civilian displacement, increased encrypted communications, changes in local market activity. These aren't things your algorithm can quantify, but they matter." She hesitated. "So, what do you recommend?" "Revise the assessment. Flag it as moderate to high probability. And make sure the task force is on alert." She looked uncertain, but she nodded. "Yes, ma'am." 3 days later, the border region erupted. A coordinated military operation, swift and precise, exactly the kind of action Brennan's model had said was unlikely. Her revised assessment, pushed up the chain because of my insistence, meant our forces were prepared. No casualties, no surprise, no chaos. Brennan came to my office afterward, her expression subdued. "You were right. I was experienced. There's a difference." She sat down without asking, something she wouldn't have done before. "How did you know? What did you see that the model didn't?" I leaned back, considering how to explain 2 decades of instinct. "The model sees patterns in data. I see patterns in people. I've watched conflicts build and collapse. I've seen how fear moves through populations before bullets do. The model is smart, Captain. But it's not wise. Wisdom comes from experience, from being wrong enough times that you learn to recognize when something doesn't fit." She absorbed that, nodding slowly. "I thought you were just resistant to new methods." I'm not resistant to new methods. I'm resistant to overconfidence. Use your tools. Trust your data. But always, always question your conclusions. Because the cost of being wrong isn't academic. It's lives. She left different than she'd arrived. Not humbled, exactly, but aware. Aware that expertise wasn't just about intelligence, it was about time, about mistakes, about the weight of decisions that stayed with you long after the mission ended. Word spread, as it always did. The story of Brennan's near miss, of the colonel who'd trusted her gut over the algorithm and been right. It reinforced something I'd been trying to teach for years. Technology was powerful, but judgment was irreplaceable. Mallory, now a lieutenant colonel himself, stopped by my office one evening. He'd been selected for a command position, would be leaving my wing in a few months. We'd never become friends, but we developed something more valuable, mutual respect. Heard about Brennan, he said, settling into the chair across from me. She's lucky you were watching. She's competent. She just needed to learn the limits of her tools. Like I did. I smiled, just a little. Like you did. He was quiet for a moment, then said, I'm recommending you for the War College faculty. Guest instructor position, leadership, and strategic decision-making. They need someone who can teach what can't be learned from textbooks. I frowned. I'm not an academic. No, but you're a leader. And you understand something that most instructors don't, that leadership is earned in the field, not the classroom. These officers need to hear that. From someone who's lived it. I didn't commit, but I didn't refuse either. The idea of stepping away from operational command, even partially, felt like retreat. But maybe it was time. Maybe the best way to shape the future wasn't by holding on to my position, but by teaching the next generation how to hold theirs. The academy invitation came a month later. A semester-long rotation, teaching senior officers preparing for command positions. I accepted. The students were different from the cadets I'd spoken to before. These were majors and lieutenant colonels, officers with experience, with scars, with their own stories of failure and triumph. They didn't need inspiration. They needed tools, frameworks, ways to think about the impossible decisions that command required. I taught them the way I'd learned, through scenarios, through mistakes, through honest conversations about the cost of leadership. I didn't sugarcoat it. I told them about Solstice, about the moments when I'd been terrified, about the nights I'd second-guessed every decision. I told them about Mallory, about the briefing room, about learning that respect was something you maintained, not something you achieved once and kept forever. One student, a Marine lieutenant colonel, asked the question I'd been waiting for. Colonel, how do you know when to trust your instinct over the data? I thought about Brennan, about the border region, about all the times I'd been right and all the times I'd been wrong. You don't, I said finally. Not for certain. But you develop a sense for when something doesn't fit, when the picture is incomplete. And you learn to live with the uncertainty, to make the call even when you're not sure, because waiting for certainty means people die. The room was silent. These were officers who understood that weight, who'd carried it themselves. They weren't looking for easy answers. They were looking for permission to be human, to be uncertain, to make the hard calls anyway. Leadership isn't about being right all the time, I continued. It's about being responsible all the time. Own your decisions. Learn from your mistakes. And never, ever let arrogance convince you that you know more than you do. After class, several officers approached me. Some wanted to discuss specific scenarios. Others just wanted to say thank you, to acknowledge that the honesty mattered. One, a Navy commander, said something that stayed with me. I thought I knew what leadership was. But listening to you, I realize I've been focused on command, not on character. There's a difference. There is, I agreed. And the difference matters. The semester passed quickly. When it ended, I returned to my operational command, but something had shifted. I'd spent months teaching, sharing, passing on lessons I'd learned through blood and failure. And in doing so, I'd realized that my value wasn't just in what I could do, it was in what I could teach others to do. The uniform I wore carried weight, but not just because of my rank or my ribbons. It carried weight because I'd filled it with purpose, with accountability, with the understanding that leadership was service. And service meant giving the next generation the tools to succeed, even if it meant stepping aside so they could lead. I wasn't ready to retire. Not yet. But I was ready to acknowledge that my role was changing. From operator to mentor. From warrior to teacher. From the officer who earned respect through action to the officer who built respect in others. It wasn't the career I'd imagined at 22. But it was the career I'd built, mission by mission, decision by decision, lesson by lesson. And I was proud of it. The final chapter of my story wasn't written in combat or in briefings. It was written in quiet moments, in decisions no one saw, in the slow accumulation of influence that shaped not just missions, but careers. 3 years after my stint at the War College, I received the call I'd been half expecting. A promotion board recommendation for Brigadier General. Oh, 7. The first star. It wasn't guaranteed. These selections were political as much as professional, but my record was strong, my command evaluation stellar, and I had support from senior officers who understood what I'd built. I sat with the news for a full day before telling anyone. Not because I wasn't proud, but because I wasn't sure I wanted it. The star would mean leaving operational command, stepping into policy and strategy at the highest levels. It would mean more politics, more bureaucracy, less direct impact on the missions that had defined my career. Rios found me in my office that evening, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He'd made colonel the year before, was running his own intelligence division. We didn't see each other as often anymore, but the bond remained. You heard, I said. It wasn't a question. Everyone's heard. Nightfang's getting her star. He handed me a coffee, sat down. Congratulations. I haven't accepted yet. He raised an eyebrow. You're considering turning it down? I'm considering whether I can do more good as a colonel than as a general. He sipped his coffee, thinking. You know what you told me once? After solstice? You said the mission wasn't about glory, it was about impact. You've had impact as a colonel. Imagine what you could do as a general. Generals don't fly missions. They don't mentor junior officers one-on-one. They shape policy, he interrupted. They influence doctrine. They make decisions that affect thousands of officers, not just the ones in their immediate command. You've spent 25 years proving yourself, Mara. Maybe it's time to use that proof to change the system. I didn't respond immediately. He was right, but it didn't make the choice easier. I'd built my identity on being hands-on, on being in the field, on knowing the details of every operation. Could I step back? Could I trust others to carry the work forward? Think about it, Rios said, standing to leave. But don't take too long. The Air Force needs leaders who remember what it's like to fly. I accepted the promotion 2 weeks later. The ceremony was larger this time, more officers, more attention, more weight. General Porter, now retired but present as a guest, pinned the star onto my shoulder himself. The Air Force is better because you're in it, General Keane, he said quietly. Don't forget that. I won't, sir. Mallory was there too, now a full colonel, commanding his own wing. He'd sent me a message the day before. You taught me what leadership means. Now teach the rest of them. I intended to. My first assignment as a brigadier general was to a joint task force reviewing military readiness and force modernization. It was exactly the kind of policy work I dreaded, long meetings, thick reports, competing priorities from different branches. But it was also an opportunity. An opportunity to advocate for the officers on the ground, to ensure that modernization didn't just mean new technology, but better support, better training, better recognition of expertise. I pushed for reforms that valued experience alongside innovation. I fought for mentorship programs that paired senior officers with junior ones, ensuring knowledge transfer didn't die with retirements. I advocated for promotion boards that looked beyond metrics to consider character, judgment, the intangibles that separated good officers from great ones. Not every fight was successful. Bureaucracy moved slowly, and entrenched interests resisted change. But I made progress. Incremental, frustrating, but real. One day, I received an email from Captain Brennan, now a major. She was teaching at the academy, running a course on intelligence analysis. She'd reached out to thank me, to tell me that the lessons I'd taught her about balancing data with judgment had become the foundation of her curriculum. I tell my students about you, she wrote. About Nightfang, about the colonel who trusted her instinct and saved lives. They need to know that leadership isn't just about being smart, it's about being wise. I read the email twice, then filed it away. Not because it wasn't important, but because it was. Because it was proof that the work mattered, that the lessons were spreading, that the system was changing one officer at a time. Years passed. I made Major General, 08, took on larger commands, shaped policy at levels I'd never imagined. But the work that mattered most wasn't the promotions or the influence. It was the officers I mentored, the policies I shaped, the culture I helped build. I attended Mallory's promotion ceremony when he made Brigadier General. He'd become everything I'd hoped, a leader who valued competence, who mentored his officers, who understood that respect was earned through service. When he gave his acceptance speech, he mentioned me by name. "I wouldn't be here without Colonel, General Keane," he said, correcting himself with a small smile. "She taught me that rank gives you authority, but character gives you command." That lesson has shaped everything I've done since. The room applauded. I didn't. I just nodded, acknowledging what we both knew, that growth was hard, that learning was painful, that the best leaders were the ones who'd been broken and rebuilt themselves stronger. 10 years after that briefing room, after the laughter and the shame and the moment I reclaimed my name, I stood in front of another room. This one was filled with senior officers, policymakers, civilian leaders. I was giving the keynote address at a defense symposium on leadership in the 21st century. I'd written and rewritten my remarks a dozen times, trying to find the right balance between inspiration and honesty. In the end, I discarded the script and spoke from memory. Leadership, I began, is not about being the smartest person in the room. It's not about having the most advanced technology or the most prestigious education. Leadership is about character. It's about making hard decisions and living with them. It's about earning respect, not demanding it. And it's about building a culture where the next generation can succeed. I told them about Solstice, about Mallory, about Brennan. I told them about the officers who doubted me and the officers who'd learned from me. I told them that the military I joined 28 years ago wasn't the military we had now, and that was a good thing. Progress was painful, but it was necessary. Rank gives you authority, I said, echoing the words I'd spoken so many times before. But character gives you command. And character is built in the moments when no one is watching, when the stakes are highest, when you have to choose between what's easy and what's right. The room was silent when I finished. Then someone started clapping. Then another. Then the entire room rose to their feet. I didn't smile. I never had. But I felt something close to satisfaction, the kind that comes from knowing you've done the work, that you've left the system better than you found it. After the symposium, I walked across the base alone, the evening sun casting long shadows. I thought about the lieutenant who'd walked into that briefing room so many years ago, who'd been mocked and dismissed, who'd spoken her call sign and reclaimed her power. She felt like a different person now. Older, wiser, worn by the years but not broken. She'd fought for respect and earned it. She'd mentored officers and watched them surpass her. She'd shaped policy and changed culture. She'd done the work. And the work had mattered. I passed a group of junior officers, lieutenants and captains, young and eager, heading toward the flight line. One of them, a woman, glanced at me as I passed. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw the stars on my shoulders. "Ma'am," she said, snapping to attention. I returned the salute. At ease. "What's your name, Lieutenant?" "Cortez, ma'am." "First Lieutenant Emily Cortez." "Where are you headed, Cortez?" "Night training exercise, ma'am." "First solo navigation run." I smiled, just a little. "Fly well, Lieutenant. And remember, rank gives you authority. Character gives you command." She nodded, uncertain but determined. "Yes, ma'am." I watched her go, this young officer who didn't know my history, didn't know my call sign, didn't know the battles I'd fought. She didn't need to. She just needed to fly well, to serve with honor, to build her own legacy. That evening, I sat in my quarters, still in uniform, looking at the photograph on my wall. It had been placed there years ago after I'd made Colonel. A grainy image from Operation Solstice, my F-16 on a makeshift runway, smoke in the background, 2 men being loaded onto a medevac chopper. Below it, A small plaque, Nightfang. Solstice survivor. I didn't need the photograph to remember. The memory was etched into my bones, into every decision I'd made since. But it served a purpose. It reminded me why I wore the uniform, why I'd fought so hard to earn respect, why I'd spent decades building a culture that valued character over comfort. The laughter from that briefing room still echoed sometimes, late at night when sleep wouldn't come. But it didn't sting anymore. It had become something else, a reminder that respect was fragile, that it required vigilance, that every generation had to learn the same lessons the hard way. But they were learning. Officers like Mallory, like Brennan, like Cortez, they were building something better. Not perfect, but better. And that was enough. I stood, moved to the window, looked out over the base. Lights flickered in the distance, aircraft taking off for night operations, officers working late, the endless rhythm of military life. Somewhere out there, a young lieutenant was flying her first solo run, nervous and excited and determined to prove herself. She didn't know it yet, but she was carrying forward a legacy, not mine specifically, but all of ours. Every officer who'd fought for respect, who'd mentored the next generation, who'd understood that leadership wasn't about glory but about service. Rank gave you authority, but character gave you command. And command, I'd learned, wasn't about holding power. It was about giving it away to the officers you trained, to the culture you built, to the system you left behind. I'd done that. And whatever came next, that would be enough. Thanks for watching. If you've ever had to earn respect the hard way, this one's for you. Tell me, have you ever been dismissed in a room you'd already earned? What did you do? Would you have filed a formal reprimand, or coached them like I did? Why? For my military folks, what's your branch and rank, and what's the moment that defined your call sign? Where are you tuning in from? If this hit home, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a backbone today.